Okay, so we're recording. So Professor Kotler, who is usually spent in Kharkiv, he's now in Kiev, in World Ukraine. And it's really a miracle that Professor Kotler can join us in person and give his talk also live. Because there is blackouts in Kiev in last weeks, and it was quite not certain if he will be able to join us personally. But in any case, we have a recording of his lecture, which he sent a couple of hours ago. So if something happens, or if there is a new Russian attack on Kiev, we can have his lecture broadcasted to you in any case, but we hope that everything will go smoothly. We will start as usual with lighting of a Hanukkah lamp by a representative of the Narkiss family, and as in many years, it will be Doron Narkiss, the son of Bezalel Narkiss and grandson of Mordechai Narkiss. So Doron, please lead the candles, and after the leading, I will say a couple of words about Professor Kotler, and then we will have his presentation.
Thank you, Volodya. Hello to everyone. Good to see you. Congratulations, Professor Kotler. I'll now bless the candles. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו להדליק נר של חנוכה.
Amen.
ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, שעשה ניסים לאבותינו, בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
Amen.
מעוז צור ישועתי. Thank you.
And where is Mausur?
It doesn't come out so well on Zoom, but we can hum it.
Okay, so everybody sings alone for himself. Mausur. Okay, great. Thank you, Doron. At least something traditional we have in all these ceremonies is Hanukkah lights. And with the light of those lights, we congratulate Professor Kotler for this prize. And I would say that Professor Kotler today is the leading Ukrainian art historian who works on Jewish art in Ukraine. And he wrote extensively on Jewish history of his native town of Kharkiv, on Ukrainian Jewish artists, on Jewish architects working in Ukraine, and especially on synagogue decorations. And he devoted a lot of works to wall paintings in synagogues, both in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine, like in Romania and also in the United States and other places. And currently in the last year's Professor Kotler works on Ukrainian researchers who investigated Jewish heritage in Ukraine, and it will be the topic of his talk today. And I must add also that Professor Kotler is also an artist, and he participated himself by renovation and refurnishing of many synagogues in contemporary Ukraine. So it's a wonderful possibility when you can make research and implement the result of your research in current works. Okay, and I would like also to show you the when we give Prize Narkiss in person, we give a special paper prepared by Gilad. Where is it? Oh, I would like only to show it to the participants, but you can see it as share screen here. So I hope that you see it, and Zenia, we will send you this this certificate by post, and hoping that it will arrive to Kiev. If it doesn't arrive, we will give it to you when we meet in person. And now I think that it's enough for introductions, and we can go ahead and have your talk about Ukrainian historians and researchers who worked on Jewish heritage in Ukraine. So Professor Kotler, the screen is yours, and I hope that everything will go smoothly. Please unmute yourself. No, we don't hear you, Zenia. Unmute you, please. Yeah. Oh, now it's better.
Thank you, Audia. Thank you, the Center for Jewish Art, for this award. Dear colleagues, I am now talking to you from Kiev at night. Night in the literal and figurative sense. We have problems with electricity due to the constant shelling of Russia, but we hold on. All this is not a test in comparison with our military on the front line. Among them are many of my students and colleagues, including art critics and historians. Thank you so much for this award, for supporting me and in my person all of Ukraine. I want to offer a lecture about this connection between the Ukrainian and Jewish contexts through the sphere of Jewish art. Let me turn on my presentation. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to the Center for Jewish Art for awarding me this prestigious award. This is a great support not only for me, but for the whole of Ukraine in its current war with Russia and its struggle for freedom and independence. A struggle that did not begin on February 24 of this year, and not even in 2014, but much, much earlier. Today is an exciting moment for me for two reasons. Firstly, the attention of the whole world is currently related on Ukraine, and for all of us, this is a huge historical chance to relate our history and culture, and in this case about the Jewish heritage, which is connected to the world context much more than one can imagine. Secondly, today more than ever, I feel a living connection with all those to whom I owe this event. I want to dedicate this award to my family and parents who, for historical reasons, were spiritually Soviet people, but mentally and morally preserved their Jewish identity. They wholeheartedly supported my passion for Jewish art as a Ukrainian Jew, artist, and researcher. I also dedicate the award to my teachers from the Kharkiv State Academy of Design and Arts, who supported my Jewish initiatives in the creative and scientific field in the distant 90s. It all started almost 30 years ago. Years of cooperation with the Institute of Judaic Studies in Kyiv and the Sefer Center gave an unforgettable experience and connections with colleagues around the world. With special warmth and gratitude, I remember today my dearest teachers and senior colleagues who became my guides to the world of the Ukrainian Jewish art of the previous decades. Let me turn on the presentation. Although I need to have demonstration screen.
You have it basically. Let me do it again. Yeah. Please try now.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Is it okay?
Yes, I see it.
Oh.
If you can, slideshow, make slideshow.
Thanks.
Oh, wonderful.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And finally, I dedicate this award to the generation of Ukrainian art historians of the 1920s and 30s, who made a huge contribution to the study and preservation of Jewish culture and art monuments. A huge gap separates us from them, the times of Stalin's repressions, the Holocaust, and post-war anti-Semitism. Each of these tragic rollers of history erased the Jewish files. Only recently have they begun to return to our culture. Today, more than ever, I feel that the shadows of these people are crying out to be given an individual and collective voice after a century. They're crying out to be named. This forced me to speak not so much as a researcher, but as a person. Since some of our audience members are not specialists of this topic, I will outline the big picture for a better understanding of what we had, what we lost, and what we are trying to recover. Despite the massive destruction of the current war, I want to step back to 2014 to show a panorama of Ukrainians' Jewish heritage before the annexation of Crimea and the war in the southeast within the 1991 borders, when Ukraine gained independence. As you know, the territory of modern Ukraine absorbed parts of many European countries where Jews historically lived. At various times, some of its territories were part of the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. But above all, the Jews of Ukraine were part of Eastern European Jewry, the center of which was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Since the late 18th century, after the partitions of Poland, the bulk of the territory of present-day Ukraine was ceded to the Russian Empire and became part of the Pale of Settlement, introduced as part of the Tsarist regime's anti-Jewish policy. This influenced the conservation of many local forms of Jewish life and determined the specifics of its culture through to the Soviet era and later. The position of Jews in the territory that went to Austria was different, especially after 1867, when Austro-Hungary was formed and all restrictions were removed from the Jews. By the start of the 20th century, the number of Jews in all these lands exceeded 2.5 million. In its current borders, Ukraine united the right bank of Dnieper with the historical lands of Galicia, Podolia, and Volhynia, where the history of the Jews dates back to the 13th century. On the left bank of the Dnieper, it included Slobozhanщina and Donbass, where Jews appeared only at the end of the 18th century. Finally, to the south, Ukraine is enclosed by the Black Sea lands and Crimea, where Jews appeared in ancient times. In addition to Ashkenazi Jews, Krimchaks and Karaites also lived here. With all the originality of Jewish cultural tradition in different regions, the main Ashkenazi population was united by a single Eastern European context, which manifested itself in the traditional way of life and forms of traditional art that served it. However, throughout the 20th century, this rich culture was destroyed by pogroms, wars, the Holocaust, Soviet atheistic and anti-Semitic policies, the practice of appropriating and erasing the cultural heritage of people, and ban on national life. Let us recall the old wooden synagogues, none of which survived the Holocaust. All this has turned the Jewish cultural landscape of Ukraine almost into a desert. My whole extended family were participants and witnesses of all these dramatic events of the 20th century. In the early 19th, in the wake of the Jewish revival in independent Ukraine, an unprecedented surge of interest in Jewish culture and heritage began. Synagogues were restored and reconstructed, cemeteries preserved, and new museum collections formed. Ukraine's Jewish heritage reached a foreign audience after the publication of a 2005 report by the American Commission on the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. More than 1,600 synagogues, Jewish cemeteries, mass graves, and Holocaust memorials were explored and documented. Since then, these numbers have increased. The remains of the Jewish cultural landscape can be found today in the historical buildings of cities and former shtetls. A separate map documents the places of Jewish pilgrimage, like Nijibish, Uman, and present-day Chernivtsi, with the graves of the great Hasidic tzaddikim. A few words about the old synagogues. Among the roughly 500 known buildings are about 40 16th to 18th century fortress synagogues concentrated in the west of Ukraine, and around 50 choral synagogues from the turn of the 19th century. Only 10 or so synagogue murals have survived, offering examples of the symbolic plots used to decorate of traditional synagogues and the ornamental decoration of Reformed temples. Let's not forget about the Karaite kenosis in Crimea and other cities of Ukraine, where about 10 buildings have been preserved, approximately half of the original number. Ancient Jewish cemeteries have been preserved in hundreds of cities and towns, many of them unique in their artistic value. Finally, memorials to the victim of the Holocaust. During the Soviet period, this topic was hushed up by the authorities, but it became a priority for the Jewish revival in Ukraine, reaching a new level on the eve of the current war. In terms of museums, large collections of traditional Jewish art can only be seen in the state museums of Kyiv and Lviv. To this, we add small Jewish collections in local history museums in Ukraine and collections of works by Jewish artists in many art museums in the country. The histories of these collections are full of tragic stories about the nationalization of synagogues and the repression of the closure of Jewish museums and the redistribution of collections during the Soviet era. From the late 1990s, Jewish museums began to appear at synagogues and community centers, which later gained independence and became a separate movement. Thus, on the territory of modern Ukraine, a huge and diverse cultural layer of the centuries-old life of the Jewish people was concentrated, traces of which can be seen in many Jewish museums around the world. It is important to understand that this is only a small part of the Jewish landscape that existed before the Holocaust. And it's hard to believe that this vast world of Jewish heritage was left without the close attention of local researchers who found it in the final period of existence. It's just that the subsequent ideologies of the Soviet regime erased this layer along with those who created it. The photo I chose for my lecture poster symbolized this. Great efforts are needed to be able to identify these people and bring them back from oblivion along with their labors. In the late 1990s, I looked through the personal files of Kharkiv art historians who were accused of counter-revolutionary activities in the archives of the Soviet repressive agencies of 1933. All this happened in my native Kharkiv, which in those years was the capital of Ukraine. This was the beginning of the defeat of the milieu of Ukrainian art historians, which in fact began earlier and continued throughout the 30s. I started to study this topic in more depth, discovering the impressive scope of our predecessors' achievements. Most of them were replaced along with the destroyed Ukrainian-speaking intelligentsia, later called the Execute Renaissance. I will now focus specifically on pre-war Soviet Ukraine. Bear in mind that in what is now Western Ukraine, the situation was fundamentally different until 1939, with Jewish life, independent research, and private collecting continuing there. In the Soviet part of Ukraine, a contradictory situation developed. On the one hand, the authorities saw the development of national cultures as a way to solve national problems. This was initially supported by the so-called indigenization policy, which until the early 30s supported the development of the USSR's non-Russian population. In line with Stalin's slogan, the culture of these non-great Russian peoples was to be, I quote, national in form and socialist in content, end quote. For the same reasons, the features of the old Jewry became a tool for educating the Jews of the new proletarian state. However, most Ukrainian researchers approached this issue differently, being rooted in a broad pre-revolutionary Ukrainophile movement that had developed as a form of cultural opposition in Tsarist times. They believed the time had come to truly build the Ukrainian nation and revive its culture. In this context, Jewish culture was perceived as a part of the multinational Ukrainian culture, within which Jewish movements were also studied. Two leading Ukrainian art historians, Fedor Ernst and Danilo Sherbakivsky, gave a separate place to Jewish art in their plan for the first textbook on Ukrainian art in 1925. Even earlier, a plan to develop the first state museum included presenting all the oldest ethnic groups of Ukraine, including Jews. The growth of interest in the Jewish artistic heritage awakened at the dawn of the 20th century, resonating strongly after Simon Ansky's ethnological expeditions in 1912 to 14. In the same years, articles on Jewish art by Rachel Bernstein-Wischnitzer were published, in particular on the art of Jews in Poland and Lithuania for the volume History of the Jewish People. But interest arose even earlier in the Ukrainian academic milieu, thanks to the professor Grigory Pavlutsky of Kyiv University, an art historian of antiquity in love with his native Ukrainian art. Before the revolution, it was defined as part of Russian art, and his article, Ancient Synagogues of Little Russia, was included in the Mayor Imperial Project, History of Russian Art. This theme was later developed by his students and followers, but all against the backdrop of intensive destruction of shtetls due to Sovietization, fires, and wars. Danilo Sherbakivsky, who was a student of Pavlutsky, called for intensification of research on Jewish movements in his article on Jewish art. The active work of many organizations, especially the All Ukrainian Archaeological Committee, which supported museum construction and research of folk art, testifies to the desire to ensure Jewish art took its rightful place not only in academia and museums, but also in showcases of Ukrainian culture. A wide network of museums with Jewish collections started to appear throughout the country. Along with the Jewish museums in Odessa and Kyiv, under the Kulturliga, collections of Jewish art complemented exhibitions in the Historical Museum in Kyiv, the Museum of Ukrainian Art in Kharkiv, and the Jewish sections of provincial museums in Poltava, Berdichev, Vinnytsia, Bela Tserkva, Kamensk-Podilsky, Chernihiv, Tulchin, and elsewhere. This foreshadowed the rapid development of Jewish ethnography and art and the formation of a new environment for researchers. Almost all museums organized expeditions in the former Jewish Pale of Settlement in order to fix monuments, replenish collections, and study the life of all Jewry, all against a backdrop of religious persecution, nationalization of synagogues, and seizure of religious artifacts, which were often used to add to museum collections. Against this background, a contradiction arose between the Soviet authorities' desire to eradicate a religion and the museums and the devotees' desire to show traditional culture in all its variety of unique forms. In the 1930s, as policies and class attitudes changed, this conflict intensified, leading to the sad fate of these collections and their creators, who were accused of counter-revolution and bourgeois nationalism. The current war has given a sense of personal involvement in the cause and destinies of these people. I felt this acutely during our evacuation from Kharkiv to Lviv in early March of this year. Feeling from shelling and bombardment, we drove west through the whole of Ukraine along roads that were not yet destroyed by the Russian army. Our path lay through central Ukraine and former Jewish shtetls abandoned by Hasidic pilgrims due to the war. For the first time in my life, I felt that I was in familiar places not as an explorer, but as a refugee. Places for me and my family became a shelter. This mystical feeling of a tunnel of salvation prepared for such events by the Hasidic tzaddikim built here opened for me a new horizon of understanding of the Jewish heritage. I wrote about this on the Jewish Heritage of Europe website in May. I also imagined Jewish and Ukrainian researchers who were here long before me in similar circumstances, such as Simeon Ansky before the First World War, when this world was still quite alive, and Pavlo Zholtovsky 15 years after him, when he found Jewish towns destroyed by war and pogroms. I recalled his description and photographs of the Beit Midrash and the grave of the Baal Shem Tov in Medjugorje standing in the same place. My generation had already become a completely different species. Like him and his associates, I frantically photographed tombstones, trying to save them for posterity from possible destruction. Pavlo Zholtovsky was a young employer of the Museum of Ukrainian Art in Kharkiv under its director Stefan Taranushenko. In a small team, they traveled all over Ukraine, fixing and measuring monuments of architecture and art. Zholtovsky went on scientific journeys on foot when the spring snow was still melting, and returned in late autumn when it began to fall. He knew Jewish life well since he was born and raised in the Pale of Settlement. The archives contained hundreds of photographs of small town buildings, stone and wooden synagogues, among which the interiors, artifacts, and murals of wooden synagogues that later burnt down are particularly interesting. He was the first researcher to compare the Podolia and Carpathian traditions of synagogue murals. I also heard they took a particular interest in Jewish tombstones, though I have not yet found these materials. After his arrest and exile, his collection miraculously survived, ending up in Kiev. He was allowed to return to normal work in post-war Lviv. He was more fortunate than others. It was only in the 1960s he began to publish materials from his pre-war trips, releasing the only post-war Soviet article on Jewish art monuments. His other publications mentioning Jewish metal work or synagogue murals indicated some Jewish presence in the Ukrainian artistic context, but that was all. In the same place, in Medjugorje, my feet led me to the place where, almost 100 years ago, the young architect Elukim Maltz sat with a sketchbook. In 1927, together with his friend Usher Hitter, they collected materials for the Jewish Museum in Odessa. Most of their drawings of Jewish buildings, synagogues, and tombstones were made at this time, although they sketched Jewish objects in other years. Their work can be seen on the surviving photograph from the opening of the museum. With great difficulty in the archives of many countries and collections, it was possible to find originals and reproductions of their works, which are worthy of a separate publication. From talking to their families, I realized that neither of the architects ever told their children about this. A possible reason for this was the museum's closure and the execution of many Jewish cultural figures in Odessa, including the museum's director, Benson Rubinstein, who spent his life saving Jewish cultural values. But back to Danila Shcherbakivsky. We moved to Kiev 6 months ago. I finally managed to find his grave on the territory of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. Shcherbakivsky, one of the leaders of the All-Ukrainian Archaeological Committee and the founder of the All-Ukrainian Historical Museum, played a leading role both through his own studies of Jewish art and by introducing students to this field. He studied Jewish art in parallel with Ukrainian art for more than 20 years and left a huge legacy: photographs, measurements, bibliography, and most importantly, his diaries and manuscripts. He's focused on synagogues and tombstones, developing a registration form for synagogues and their interior decoration, paying great attention to the specific details of Jewish monuments. His texts express his desire to understand and essence and basis of Jewish artistic tradition. When flummoxed, he involved local Jews, noting along the way that even masters no longer knew the meaning of many symbols. Based on his field materials, he wrote the first ever study on Jewish tombstones, analyzing their forms, plots, and style of images, and developing a classification system. Most Ukrainian academics of that era did not delve into the semantics and hermeneutics of Jewish art, deeming it an inaccessible topic. So I want to emphasize that this work was carried out long before Jewish researchers turned to this topic, armed with new approaches. Since Shcherbakivsky did not know Jewish languages, he did not write, but rather drew letters from tombstones, synagogue inscriptions, and ritual objects. Today, it is not easy to read many of them or to systematize the scattered material, but we can find many interesting stories. Some reveal new themes of local traditions. For example, we learn about a craftsman called Dov Berg from Shepetivka, who made great Hanukkah menorahs with unique iconography for synagogues in the early 18th century. Priceless materials were also collected during his last expedition in 1926 to Podole and Volhynia, recorded in his diary, and later in the above-mentioned articles on Jewish monuments. Some of the original Jewish Mizrahim and Rezele are still kept in the National Art Museum of Ukraine. Thanks to his photographs and plans for a wooden synagogue in Talne, Cherkasy region, the Tolner Rebbe's descendants in Israel accessed and revived the memory of the old synagogue in Ukraine through the decoration of the Torah Ark in the New Jerusalem synagogue. Sherbakovsky's plans to study Jewish monuments were cut short by his mysterious suicide in 1927, which heralded an even more tragic era of Stalinist repressions. Many of Sherbakovsky's students, following their mentors' methods, undertook expeditions to explore Ukrainian Jewish art in many synagogues and cemeteries. Some worked directly with Sherbakovsky, others received independent assignments. For example, Elizaveta Levitska explored old wooden synagogues and made copies of them, but her drawings have not survived. Natalia Kotsubinskaya studied the techniques and secrets of all Jewish jewelers and left dozens of drawings and stampings of tombstones collected for the report, Tombstones of Old Jewish Cemeteries in Ukraine. Maria Vezmitina and Maria Novitska explored the Jewish cemetery in Borispil, Kyiv region. Their drawings speak of a different tradition of tombstones in this region compared to Western Ukraine. Sherbakovsky himself emphasized that the Central Dnieper region was understudied by researchers of Jewish art and tried to close this gap. In addition to capital cities, Jewish regional local history was also developing. I just want to mention the names of the director of the Kamenets-Podilsky Art and Industrial School, Volodymyr Gaginmeister, and his colleague Kost Krzemiński, who for many years researched the region's Ukrainian folk art and published unique books on it. The destruction of these researchers and their works hid from us two unique albums with copies of paintings from Smotrich Synagogue and drawings of tombstones in Kamenets-Podilsky. By chance, I found individual sheets with lithographs of tombstones from this edition in the National Art Museum of Ukraine. This discovery had an important personal meaning for me, since almost all my mother's relatives died at the hands of the Nazis in this city. I must also recall Gustav Brilling, who stood at the origins of the Vinnytsia Museum of Local Law, which housed a large collection of Jewish photographs that conveys to us view of the famous Jewish quarters, the Vinnytsia Jerusalemka. The museum also held a unique collection of Purim brettel, wooden carved molds for baking cookies for the Purim holiday. Together with the Odessa Jewish Museum, Brilling was going to publish an album about monuments of Jewish antiquity, but he was repressed and died in a gulag along with his dreams. The museum in Berdichev made close contact with the same Odessa Museum. Feodosy Movchanivsky, with his Jewish colleagues, created a large Jewish center. There is more than 1,000 exhibits. He sought to officially legitimize the famous wooden synagogue in Pogrebische as a state monument and exhibit Jewish artifacts there. But they managed to do something similar only with a part of the Berdichev Jewish cemetery. The idea of founding an all-Ukrainian Jewish museum in Kyiv and Ukrainian Jewish art section under the All-Ukrainian Archaeology Committee was in the air of that times. Isaac Manevich, a prominent official collector and connoisseur of Jewish antiquity, was one of the instigators of this idea, motivated by the fact that high concentration of first-class Jewish monuments of Ukraine's territory. He considered it important to trace, I quote, the process of interaction between the forms of Jewish and Ukrainian art, end quote. He was also arrested. After his release, he lost himself into a different life where no one remembered the past. I must say a few words about researchers in exile, in particular Georgy Lukomsky, associated today with both Russian and Ukrainian, as well as European culture. His creative output included many drawings, albums, and publications dedicated to synagogues. There are now scattered all over the world, yet his name as a researcher of Jewish art was almost unknown in Ukraine until recently. During his trips around the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe, he noted the specifics of Jewish buildings, emphasizing both in texts and in drawings its exoticism and poetic antiquity. However, he gained fame after immigrating from Soviet Russia, where he again returned to the Jewish theme. It was in Europe, against the background of Nazism's unfolding and the elimination of Jewish researchers, that his role became unique. Lukomsky fills an entire segment of the European art market, exhibiting numerous drawings of synagogues at exhibitions across Europe, from Madrid to London. Almost all of them were made from pre-war photographs by many researchers. Lukomsky emphasizes in them the charm of antiquity, which, against the backdrop of catastrophic destruction, enhances their memorial value in the eyes of Jewish connoisseurs. His 1947 work, Jewish Art in European Synagogues, connects pre-war studies with the post-war School of Synagogue Studies. He links to the well-known ASEAN theory of Slavic architecture, linking wooden synagogues' origins with the forms of ancient pagan temples. However, no one in Soviet Ukraine knew about his controversial theories and post-war drawings, because as an immigrant, he was cut off from his homeland. I have mentioned only the most striking examples, but there are other names and stories. The only person who combined the entire 20th century in her life and work on Jewish art was the aforementioned Rachel Benstein-Vishnitzer, who emigrated from Russia to Europe and later to America, leaving a huge scientific legacy. Ukrainian art historians knew her early works on Jewish art, but she hardly even heard their names in Berlin or New York, far from Soviet Ukraine. Forgotten and abandoned in Soviet Ukraine, the sphere of Jewish art migrated abroad, where it became the object of extensive art criticism, closed by an Iron Curtain until the collapse of the USSR. Many of these studies invariably featured Ukrainian lands and their Jewish heritage. I want to highlight that fact that most of these researchers were not ethnic Jews, but understood the significance and artistic value of Jewish art and folk culture. They made it possible to distinguish outstanding monuments. They recorded and described them, offering their own theories and methods of analysis. Although they did not approach monuments as cultural insiders, and their methods were limited, they brought to us the whole world of Jewish art in Ukrainian lands with its wide regional and stylistic diversity. Almost a century ago, they created a serious scientific milieu and a base for the study of Jewish art, which had every chance of developing into a leading European center. Unfortunately, few managed to convey their research. Most were killed or sent to camps, their works destroyed, abandoned, and forgotten. In the post-war Soviet era, none dared to pick up this baton. Ukrainian art, already ideologically shifted and censored by the authorities, lost its Jewish chapter, as if it had never existed. Today, most of their works remain on archival shelves in manuscripts, photographs, drawings, and a few museum collections, little known even to specialists. But it is safe to say that were it not for the tragic consequences of the last century, today's Ukraine would be host to a powerful scientific school of Jewish art and a wide network of Jewish museums and collections. And Jewish art would long ago have been inscribed in the anthology of Ukrainian culture and art as an integral organic part. And if you add Western Ukraine to this, with its main cities, Lviv and Chernivtsi, its museums of Jewish culture, and outstanding researchers and collectors, then the picture would be truly impressive. Almost all these researchers died in the Holocaust, but the curtailment of their lives' work began even earlier when Soviet power came. Today, as a new round of violence and attempts to destroy Ukrainian independence are seen, the voices of these people ring especially strongly. At Russia's scorched earth policy is implemented before our eyes and Jewish monuments are destroyed, I feel a personal connection with that generation. Therefore, it is now especially important to bring back the names and works to our predecessors from oblivion and conceptualize this legacy. To restore this, the crossed out, but as it turns out, not destroyed chapter. Thank you for your attention for this award, and thank you for your sincere support for Ukraine and its just struggle for its independence and European choice for the freedom of the entire democratic world. The candles of the Hanukkah menorah that we light these days are a wonderful symbol of this struggle, this faith and hope. Hanukkah Sameach. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Zhenya. Thank you very much for a fascinating and touching presentation. And I'm sure that there will be some questions, and you can either write them in chat or try to raise your hand. But before it, I would like to stress one thing. I will share my screen for a second. The Center for Jewish Art arrived to Ukraine in 1991, and you can see a photograph with Bezalel Narkiss and Aliza Cohen-Muslin and Bill Gross, and Benjamin Lukin and Boris Khaimovich. I believe it's in Lviv somewhere, or maybe another photograph would be better. Yeah. So in 1991, 30 years ago, the largest part of what you just said was hardly known to anybody. And Ukraine, is the rest of the Soviet Union, seemed to be in a space empty of Jewish knowledge and of Jewish scholarship. And we're very glad that 30 years later, there are scholars like you, Professor Kotler, who develop Jewish studies and who research and take care about Jewish heritage in those lands. And we wish that we will continue this important work in the future as well. And so again, congratulations with the Narkiss Prize award. And do we have questions I will stop sharing my screen. Yeah, we have probably, no, I don't see any questions. Magda?
Yes, sure. I would be happy to ask. Evgeny, this was a wonderful, wonderful talk and really a beautiful account of the awareness of the shared history, of the shared heritage, cultural heritage of in Ukraine, as seen by scholars, both Jewish and not Jewish. I have a question. It seems to me that that much of this work has been done in the aftermath of many of the massacres and pogroms, and especially in the early Soviet era, in the 1920s that you showed. How much this drive to document that was motivated by the sort of sense of loss, sense of destruction, sense of the end of a chapter of Jewish history in these small towns as the survivors of these various massacres were moving into bigger cities. I guess I'll stop here.
Volodya, please help me with the translation.
Okay, sorry, I will speak in Russian.
Yeah.
Магда спросила, как бы, насколько все это исследование, оно было происходило под влиянием предыдущих погромов и вот череды потерь, как бы, вот этого кризиса времен гражданской войны. Если я правильно понял.
Да.
Если я правильно услышал.
Во-первых, важно отметить, что сами украинские исследователи подчеркивали, что тот мир, который они изучали в 20-30-е годы, на их глазах разрушался именно вследствие последствий погромов гражданской войны и вследствие пожаров.
Yeah, the researchers, the Ukrainian researchers from the 20s, they stressed by themselves that the research the world, which was damaged and disappearing during the civil war and during fires.
Большинство этих исследователей родилось в конце 19 столетия и хорошо видели разницу между тем, что было в довоенные годы, и то, что они изучали в 20-е годы.
The majority of those researchers were born in the late 19th century, and they saw the difference between what was existing there before the First World War and in the 1920s when they researched it. Yeah.
Ну вот, все они отдавали себе отчет, что все это уничтожается на их глазах, и пытались это сохранить.
Okay, and they were very aware that all this heritage is going to disappear in front of their eyes, and they tried to preserve it.
Сегодня нам трудно даже назвать приблизительно цифры, скажем, количество синагог, которое было утрачено, не говоря уже о предметах утвари синагогальной, которую так прекрасно описал Володя вместе с Кравцовым в каталоге синагоги Волыни. Это лишь отдельная часть нынешней Украины, но эти потери катастрофические. Сегодня до нас дошли просто единицы из этих артефактов.
It's hard to imagine and to count how many synagogue buildings we have lost, and impossible to get to the amount of synagogue objects which were lost and which Sergei Kravtsov and myself described in a book about Volhynia, synagogues in Volhynia, but it's only one part of Ukraine. So the amount of loss is understandable, but it's huge.
Спасибо, большое спасибо.
Okay, if any other questions?
Yes, can I put a question and congratulations to Zhenya? You show us among the other one such very controversial person, Teodosy Movchanivsky. Can you say a few words about him? Вы нам показали среди других Феодосия Молчановского. Очень противоречивый персонаж. Могли бы вы пару слов о нем сказать и вообще, и как исследователи еврейского искусства?
Рад вас приветствовать, Михаил Романович, на нашем мероприятии. Спасибо за вопрос.
Thank you for the question. We're glad to see you here.
Конечно, детально мне трудно сказать о разных сторонах жизни этой фигуры, поскольку многие музеи того времени, они были вынуждены держать двойную линию. С одной стороны, заниматься музейным делом своим, изучать памятники искусства, а с другой, как бы отвечать перед властями.
It's hard to me to describe his life and his activities, because at that time many workers of the museums had to behave and to conduct double life. One on the one hand to research what they're researching, and on the other hand to answer and to be responsible to the Soviet authorities.
Я здесь сделаю небольшое отступление, потом вернусь к этому человеку. Я помню воспоминания сына Бриллинга, о котором я говорил, из Винницкого музея.
I will make a small detour, and then we'll come back to this person. I remembers of the son of Brilling from the museum in Vinnytsia,
который вспоминал такие детали, как он приобретал предметы, а точнее их забирал в процессе национализации из синагог.
and he remembers how he purchased objects. To be more exact, he was taking them from the synagogues which were being nationalized.
То есть была еще одна интересная сторона этого дела. Это некая борьба между музейными учреждениями и синагогами, которые активно закрывали за сами предметы искусства.
So there was another aspect of the whole story. It's a struggle between museums and synagogues, which were being closed. The struggle for the objects of Jewish worship between them.
Возвращаясь к личности Молчановского и его участия именно в поддержке еврейской культуры,
Coming back to Molchanovsky and his participation in the support of Jewish culture.
У Молчановского были хорошие помощники евреи, которые помогали ему, видимо, с коммуникацией с еврейским миром, в частности Бердичева. Ну и
he had good assistants who helped him with in communicating with the Jewish world, especially the Jewish population of Бердичев.
И ориентировали его на наиболее важные ценности.
And they directed him toward the most important valuable objects.
В этом смысле он, конечно, сыграл очень важную роль именно для сохранения памятников еврейской культуры.
And in this sense, he played an extremely important role in the preservation of objects of Jewish heritage. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
More questions?
Спасибо.
Sharman.
Эта сторона мало была известна в его деятельности.
Спасибо, Михаил Романович.
Sharman, you wanted to say something? Oh, no, you are muted.
I'm muted. I'm still learning how to use stuff. This is really amazing, actually. The technology has made it possible. I have to speak in English, but I have to speak in English because my Russian isn't good enough.
Yeah,
I'm sitting in Jerusalem. I've ended up speaking, I don't know, polyglots, English, even semi-literate in English, Hebrew, Russian, Yiddish, French. I'm completely Dalit. And it's lovely. I think, Evgeny, I think we met once at a conference somewhere. I can't remember where. It was a long time ago. Could somebody translate into Russian if he has no Ukrainian?
I will translate, yeah.
Understand.
Женя Шарман говорит, что вот вы с ним, видимо, встречались, она с вами встречалась один раз где-то на какой-то конференции, которую она не помнит до какой.
Я помню прекрасно, да.
And Evgeny remembers it well.
I remember it. I remember you. Thanks.
Очень приятно. I can't speak Ukrainian. I think Sergey maybe tried to teach me that as well, but so I have to stick to English because I can't speak any of the other languages properly. And I have enough trouble with Hebrew. And so with all of this tech stuff in Israel, everybody's Piskat technologia, the cutting edge of technology. But this just reminds me, this lecture, which is really very interesting. I also identify with the art historians in the 1920s and 30s, and with them now, the people now who are trying to rescue Jewish heritage in the present war-torn conditions. And my whole career, I started off in Russian studies. I bet you want to translate, Volodya, because my Russian is...
Yeah. Шарман говорит, что она полностью идентифицируется с теми исследователями, о которых ты говорил, и она сама вообще начинала свою карьеру в Russian Studies. Sharman, if you get to the point, I will let you.
I get to the point. It's just, it isn't really a point. It's just that I'm amazed at being reconnected with everybody here, and also with my Jewish roots, because my grandmother, my Buba, left Makarov, which is Makarif, I think. How do you pronounce it in Ukrainian? In 1913, and went to London. And I was very interested to hear about George Lukomsky and Rachel Vishnitzer, because my mother's family came, my grandmother's family came from Ukraine. The rest of the family were Litvaks, Lithuanian, northern from Lithuania. I won't digress about that. And they came from this mythical place called Makarov, the shtetl, which was hidden away inside the Soviet Union. And in can you translate for me, Volodya? I don't want to go on, but it just reminds me, in 1980, it was 1981 or 82, I can't remember. I visited the Soviet Union, and it was a Gamre from what it is now. And during the 1990s, I worked at the Center for Jewish Art, and all the people in the photographs that you showed, Professor Narkiss and Lisa, hello Elisa, Chanukah Sameach, I remember, and now we've become history. We're now the older generation. Volodya, please, пожалуйста, please translate.
Да, вкратце, бабушка Шарман, она из Макарова, и она в 20-е годы уехала в Англию, была заинтересована в работах Лукомского, в работах Вишница, и они смогли посетить Советский Союз в 1982 году, когда это все выглядело совершенно по-другому. В общем, Шарман очень во все это вовлечена. Очень кратко.
Yeah.
I'm now doing my roots. I did genealogy in the 1980s when you couldn't get access. When I did my doctorate, it was my topic was on Jews in Britain and the Russian Revolution. And I published a book on my doctorate in 1992, and it was republished in 2013 because of the continuing interest. And all my research was based on Western sources, because we couldn't access the Soviet Union to look at Russian sources. So the revolution in genealogy has come about. Volodya, please, I'll stop in a moment, because I want other people to be able to join in. But I am just absolutely amazed. Here I am sitting in Israel, and I'm suddenly reconnected with my mother's family. And I still, there's lots more research I want to do about Makarov. And I only discovered recently that the family actually came from Khrushchev, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Korostyshev, from the British records, the 1921 census. So maybe you just translate that bit, and then maybe somebody else can speak. Join in.
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, Sharon, thank you. So short translation. Очень Шарман сейчас находится в Иерусалиме, и она, вот это для нее возможность связь с семьей ее бабушки в Украине, и вот соединение исследования, генеалогии, и ее книжка про евреев, восточноевропейских евреев в Британии, вышла в 91 году и недавно была переиздана, потому что это интересно. Но она вся была основана на британских источниках, потому что советские источники были закрыты, а вот сейчас все изменилось. Sharon, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Let's give possibility to Ilya Rodov to ask, and Professor Rodov will translate himself into Russian.
Yes, thank you very much. I really want to start in English because I want to express my profound respect to Professor Kotler for his scientific and academic activities. Please remember, under and despite the deadly dangers of war, and I wish freedom to him and to all the Ukrainians very, very soon. Женя, я всегда, я просто с какой-то дрожью слушал твой рассказ, потому что я хорошо помню и понимаю, что тебе пришлось пережить в последнее время. И мы всегда с тобой, и всегда мы тебя любим и помним, и беспокоимся о тебе, и очень хотим тебя видеть здесь как можно скорее, а Украину свободной как можно быстрее.
Амен.
Окей, да.
Амен.
Спасибо большое, Илья. Я тоже помню, что все началось в 94 году, когда я приехал в Израиль первый раз. И тогда встретил Илью, я понял вообще, куда я попал, по-настоящему. В какую тему и в какое будущее. Тогда никто не представлял вообще, что ждет впереди.
Zhenya says that thank you, Ilya. And when Zhenya came to Israel in 1994 for the first time, he couldn't imagine that we will arrive to such a point as doing today.
Вот. Хотя эту фразу говорят в другой праздник, но я все-таки скажу по поводу того, что хорошо бы встретиться в Иерусалиме, в следующем году обязательно увидимся.
Еще раз, я не расслышал.
Обычно фразу в следующем году в Иерусалиме говорят...
Always, Zhenya wants to say that always another holiday, but he would like to say today in the next year in Jerusalem. Okay, and we have a question from Professor Froimich. Froimich, please.
Yeah, so Evgeny, first of all, thank you so much for an absolutely unbelievable lecture. What I wanted to ask you about is a comparison with the Ansky expedition. So, Ansky managed to get there before the others, right? This is, before World War I. I know some of your other scholars also worked before World War I. But I noticed that Ansky's expedition was, I would say, multidisciplinary. Right? They were interested in everything. It was because they thought they had this framework of ethnography. In terms of methods, how would you compare the scholars that you presented today with the Ansky approach?
Okay, thank you. I will translate. So Professor Froimich asked about comparison with Ansky expeditions, which were which took place before the First World War.
Vladimir, по-русски.
Ой.
Трудности перевода.
Sorry. Да, то есть она спрашивает про сравнение с экспедициями Ански. Они были мультидисциплинарными, и сравнить с теми исследователями, про которых ты говорил.
Окей, это хороший вопрос. Во-первых, как мы все понимаем, Анский делал еврейскую экспедицию для нужд евреев.
We understand that Ansky did Jewish expeditions for the needs of the Jews.
Он понимал, что он хочет собрать, для кого он хочет собрать. Его интересовали нюансы, интересовали региональные особенности.
He knew what he wants to collect, how he wants to collect, and he was interested in nuances and in regional peculiarities.
Как я уже подчеркнул, в 20-е годы ситуация изменилась радикальным образом.
The situation in the 1920s has been changed radically.
Был очень короткий период, примерно с 1925 по 1931 год, может, чуть больше, когда ученые и исследователи смогли собрать этот уникальный материал.
It was a very short period from 1925 to 1931 when the researchers could collect this unique material.
Во-первых, они собирали его для украинских музеев. Это были в основном украинцы, но не только, этнические немцы, немножко евреев.
They collected everything for the Ukrainian museums, and they themselves were mostly Ukrainians with several Germans and several Jews involved.
Мне неизвестно, скажем, интересовала ли их, этих исследователей, такая область, как этнография с точки зрения собирания еврейской музыки или фольклора.
I don't know if they were interested in such ethnographic things as collecting of Jewish music or folklore.
Ведь главный их упор был сбор материальных артефактов.
And the main point was to collect material objects, material artifacts.
По сути, власть им дала свободу в формировании коллекций украинской культуры, в которой они
Basically, the Soviet power, Soviet authorities gave them free hand in making collections of Ukrainian museums.
Насколько мне известно, в те годы, кроме Щербаковского, никто их особенно эти вещи и не анализировал. Их задача была просто собрать и описать по определенной схеме.
As far as I know, nobody besides Sherbakovsky analyzed the objects. They only collected and described them according to a certain scheme.
А вот что касается уже изучения и анализа, это уже, наверное, задача нашего с вами поколения.
And the research and analysis, this is the task for our generation.
Спасибо за то, что они собрали для нас эти бесценные и уничтоженные вскоре материалы.
Thank you that they collected for us those valuable and materials which were later destroyed. Okay, thank you. More questions? If there are no more questions, yes, please.
So can I just follow this up? So there were, of course, other people who were collecting folk music because we've recently become much more aware of Beregovsky. Were they working separately?
Люди, которые мы знаем, что собирали там музыку, фольклор, например, Береговский, они работали порознь, они не связаны были. Вот все те ученые, про которых ты говорил.
Мне неизвестно о том, чтобы они работали, чтобы то поколение ученых, то поколение, скажем так, исследователей времен Анского, чтобы они работали вместе с этим поколением.
Нет, Береговский, он позже был, он уже...
Я понял, это не Кисельгов, я понял.
Да, Береговский не Кисельгов.
Да, окей. Да, я имею в виду, они не работали в одно время. Мне неизвестно об этих взаимоотношениях, я не знаю.
Okay. He doesn't know, Женя doesn't know.
Но это не значит, что этого не было, просто мой предмет интереса, он в основном касался материальной культуры и искусства.
It doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but Evgeny doesn't know. Okay, great. So thank you very much, Professor Kotler, for your fascinating talk. Thank you very much, everybody who came, and for your questions and for your attendance. And I hope that next year, indeed, as Evgeny said, next year in Jerusalem, and that next year we will do it without war and without atrocities that we are meeting now in the land of Ukraine. So thank you very much again, and I was glad to see all of you.
Thank you very much, Volodya. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Warm Reagan, greetings from Kiev. Bye. Thank you.